The news broke quietly in the local pages of the Lexington Herald-Leader, but its implications thundered across the global alcohol industry like a barrel rolling down a flight of stairs. Jim Beam, the titan of Kentucky bourbon, a name synonymous with American whiskey for over 2 centuries, announced it is suspending operations at a major distillery for the entirety of 2026. This is not a renovation. It is not a temporary maintenance pause. It is a mothballing, a strategic retreat forced by a market that has suddenly, violently evaporated. Part of the story here is tariffs, yes, but to say this is just about taxes is like saying the Titanic had a problem with ice. This is about a structural collapse of the cross-border alcohol trade, a diplomatic feud that turned liquor cabinets into geopolitical battlegrounds, and a Canadian retaliation strategy so precise and devastating that it effectively decapitated American alcohol exports in a matter of months. Within the United States, the damage is quantified in staggering percentages. While Canada has technically dropped its retaliatory tariffs on Kentucky bourbon, the market reality is far grimmer than any tax rate. American whiskey exports to Canada, historically the largest foreign market for U.S. spirits, collapsed by 85% in a single quarter. For the first time on record, the value of these exports dropped below $10 million. At the same time, north of the border, a different kind of drama unfolded. Canadian provincial governments didn't just stop buying, they seized millions in U.S. alcohol already in the country. They removed major American brands from government-run shelves, effectively erasing them from the consumer landscape. This report explains how a trade dispute triggered a cross-border shutdown that is reshaping bourbon markets, liquor pricing, and alcohol trade across the continent. The roots of this crisis stretch back exactly 1 year. President Donald Trump, pursuing an aggressive America First protectionist agenda, announced a sweeping new wave of tariffs on Canadian imports. The logic was familiar. Squeeze the neighbor to extract concessions. The expectation was a standard trade skirmish, some angry press conferences, perhaps a retaliatory tax on maple syrup or lumber, and then a return to the negotiating table. But Ottawa's response was anything but standard. Canada did not respond with a blunt instrument like tariffs on steel or cars, which would hurt Canadian industries as much as American ones. Instead, strategic planners in the Canadian government went after something far more visible, far more emotional, and far more politically sensitive: alcohol. To understand why this was such a lethal move, one must understand the unique architecture of the Canadian liquor market. In the United States, alcohol sales are largely privatized. If a French wine becomes expensive due to tariffs, a private liquor store in New York can still choose to stock it if customers want it. In Canada, the system is radically different. In most major provinces, liquor distribution is a government-controlled monopoly. This centralized control gave Canadian provinces a kill switch for American imports. They didn't need to rely on market forces or price adjustments. The provincial governments simply had the power to decide what stayed on shelves and what disappeared overnight. And that is exactly what happened. The rollout of the ban was swift and chaotic. American-made wine and spirits were pulled from retail shelves, seized from distribution warehouses, and frozen in transit. Unsold bourbon whiskey and prestige California wines suddenly became political casualties, trapped in a bureaucratic limbo. For the consumer walking into the Liquor Control Board of Ontario in Toronto, it looked like a boycott, empty spaces where Jack Daniels or Jim Beam used to sit. But for producers and importers, it felt like a government shutdown. One specific moment made the crisis impossible to ignore. In Ontario, major alcohol importer Rogers and Company found itself in the crosshairs. The company had over $1.5 million worth of prestige California wine seized by the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. We are not talking about bulk wine. We are talking about elite Napa Valley brands, bottles that were already sold to clients, already shipped, and already earmarked for high-end restaurant wine lists. Suddenly, those assets were locked away in government warehouses, legally inaccessible. The company's managing director described the fallout in harrowing terms: immediate staff layoffs, office closures, and delivery workers put on reduced schedules. The inventory was there, but it might as well have been on the moon. Across Canada, it is estimated that more than $100 million worth of American alcohol remains in government possession or has been liquidated, a massive inventory of stranded assets. For small U.S. producers, the damage was even more personal and immediate. Todd Cavallo, a winemaker in New York's Hudson Valley, represents the collateral damage of this trade war. He lost $10,000 in Canadian orders overnight. For a multinational corporation, that is a rounding error. For a small artisanal operation, it is a payroll cycle. Cavallo described having to take on outside work just to keep his business alive, a stark illustration of how macroeconomic policy destroys microeconomic livelihoods. Then came the data that validated the panic. In the second quarter of 2025, the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, DISCUS, released a report that stunned the global alcohol industry. The numbers were catastrophic. American spirit exports to Canada plummeted by 85%. Total value fell below $10 million total, the lowest level ever recorded in modern trade history. U.S. wine exports dropped by as much as 94%. To understand the scale of that collapse, context is required. Canada has long been one of America's most reliable and voracious buyers of alcohol. Ontario alone used to purchase nearly $1 billion worth of American alcohol annually. In 2024, a staggering 35% of all U.S. wine exports went north of the border. Then, in the span of a few months, that market didn't just shrink, it almost vanished. Chris Swanger, president of the U.S. Spirits Trade Group, issued a statement calling the situation very troubling, a diplomatic understatement for what is essentially a market erasure. He warned that American producers were being hurt significantly by the breakdown in trade relations, with no end in sight. Then came one of the most politically charged maneuvers of the entire trade war, a tactic that shifted the conflict from economic to ideological. In British Columbia, Premier David Eby openly stated that the province would target red state American liquor products. This was a calculated precision strike. The strategy was to ban or boycott products specifically from Republican-leaning states to apply pressure directly to the President of the United States and his political base. The logic was simple and ruthless. If voters in bourbon-producing states like Kentucky, home to Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and a stronghold of Trump support, started feeling the economic pain, that pressure might travel back to Washington faster than any diplomatic note. Bourbon, by federal law, can only be made in the United States. The vast majority of it comes from Kentucky. By targeting bourbon, Canada wasn't just banning a drink. It was targeting a specific American constituency. That turned a bottle of whiskey into something more than a beverage. It became a message. As American brands disappeared from shelves, something fascinating happened in the Canadian market. Consumers adapted, and they adapted fast. Liquor stores, facing empty shelf space where the bourbons and Napa cabs used to be, put up signs reading, "Buy Canadian instead." And the people listened. Patriotism, combined with necessity, drove a massive shift in consumption habits. According to provincial sales data, Canadian whiskey and wine sales jumped over 24%. Ontario VQ, wine sales, surged by a massive 56%. Local spirits, Nova Scotia saw local craft spirits rise by more than 24%. Bars and restaurants, unable to source their usual American staples, rewrote their cocktail menus to feature Canadian ryes and gins. Retailers aggressively promoted domestic brands. Holiday tastings in Toronto and Ottawa reported record-breaking sales of Canadian wine. For Canadian producers, the trade war became an unexpected golden age. One Nova Scotia distiller described customers walking into stores and asking a simple, powerful question: what is local? The psychological barrier to switching brands was shattered by the political climate. Back in the United States, the impact was rippling through the rolling hills of Kentucky. The Jim Beam shutdown is the headline, but the pain is shared across the industry. Consider the Bar Distillery, a small bourbon producer that had spent years building strong momentum in Western Canada. They expected the Canadian market to account for up to 20% of their total sales in 2026. Then the boycotts hit. Expansion plans collapsed overnight. The company's co-founder explained the grim reality. For a small distillery, every case matters. Suddenly, entire pallets of product sitting on loading docks had nowhere to go. Tourism, a vital secondary revenue stream for the whiskey industry, also took a hit. Canadian visitors to the Kentucky Bourbon Trail dropped sharply. New York's wine regions near the Niagara border reported fewer Canadian tourists, who used to cross over for weekend tastings and case purchases. Industry leaders began using a powerful word to describe what was happening to American spirits in Canada: stigmatized. It wasn't that the quality of the bourbon had dropped, it was that the product itself had become toxic. One California wine importer noted that the boycott was stigmatizing the entire category, telling consumers where to focus their resentment. Even Canadian retailers admitted the situation was emotional. While some customers were excited when U.S. bottles briefly returned to shelves later in the year, others refused to touch them on principle. For many Canadians, buying alcohol had become a political choice, a vote with their wallet. In December 2025, a strange event occurred that highlighted the severity of the split. Several provinces allowed American alcohol back into stores for a limited time. But there was a catch. The bottles were only being sold to clear expiring inventory, and the proceeds were often earmarked for charity or debt reduction. It wasn't a reopening of the market. It was a liquidation sale. Nova Scotia sold more than $2.2 million worth of American spirits in just 1 week during this period. But the province's premier made the government's position crystal clear. Once that inventory was gone, no new U.S. orders would be placed. It was a farewell sale, a final clearing of the decks before the embargo became permanent. Canada was not the only market pulling back, though it was the most aggressive. The U.S. Spirits Trade Group reported that exports to the United Kingdom fell nearly 30%, and exports to Japan dropped more than 20%. Together with Canada and the European Union, those countries make up 70% of America's international spirits market. For companies like Brown-Forman, the parent company of Jack Daniel's, the financial impact was undeniable. Sales to Canada alone dropped more than 60% in a single quarter. Executives warned investors on earnings calls that trade tensions were creating significant headwinds across their global business. When the maker of the world's best-selling whiskey says the wind is blowing in their face, the industry listens. Even if the tariffs are lifted tomorrow, many experts believe the damage will not simply vanish. Trade relationships are like muscles. If they aren't used, they atrophy. If they are torn, they leave scar tissue. Canadian consumers have spent a year discovering local alternatives. They have developed a taste for Niagara Pinot Noir and British Columbia Rye. Bars have rebuilt their wine lists and cocktail programs around non-American products. Importers are hesitant to risk purchasing American shipments that could become unsellable political footballs again. An international trade professor in Nova Scotia summed it up this way: the relationship has changed. Buying American alcohol is no longer just about taste or price. For many Canadians, it is about loyalty. So here we are, facing the wreckage of a once thriving partnership, an 85% collapse in exports, millions of dollars worth of seized bottles, bourbon distilleries shutting down operations, and Canadian producers gaining ground at home. All because a bottle of whiskey became a bargaining chip in a trade war between two neighbors who used to be each other's closest customers. This is not just a story about alcohol. It is a story about how global politics can reach into everyday life, into your glass, your bar, and your local store. And as negotiations continue behind closed doors in Washington and Ottawa, one question remains for the distillers in Kentucky. Even when the tariffs finally fall, will the shelves ever look the same?